Well, it's almost conventional wisdom now that the economic center of gravity of the world is shifting away from the Western advanced nations towards emerging markets and the BRIC nations. But we are now seeing a sudden slowdown in emerging markets as a brick hit the wall. India's growth is also falling from 9% towards 6 or 7% if we are lucky. Now, a new book that has taken the world by storm at the moment suggests that BRIC countries may be history. BRIC will be replaced by a new term, breakout nations. And it's crucially important to understand what makes a breakout nation. The book, here it is, it's called Breakout Nations by Ruchir Sharma, has been widely covered already by Time magazine, by the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Bloomberg, and to be analyzed by CNBC, BBC, David Frost, and many others. It's really the focus of economic attention around the world. It's a whole new look at which economies are going to be winners and which are going to be losers. The big question that we will be asking here is, will India be one of the breakout nations? Do we have what it takes? Or are we losing our momentum? And is India falling back to our old style of slow growth syndrome? To answer this and other questions on which are the future breakout nations, we have the author himself here, Ruchir Sharma, with us. We have the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, who rarely, if ever, appears on television, Dr. Y.B. Reddy. He joins us from Toronto. Thank you very much, sir. Sunil Mittal, the thinking businessman who owns and runs India's most successful telecom company, Airtel. And perhaps the most brilliant mind in the government, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I don't know if he thinks so, but we certainly do. He's head of our planning commission, of course. So, Ruchir, I just want to get straight into it.
Right.
What exactly is a breakout nation? And why is it important to know which ones are going to be breakout, and how does it matter?
Well, to start with, Pranoy, if you look at what happened last decade, was a freaky decade for emerging markets, in that every single emerging market did extremely well last decade. To put this in perspective, the average growth rate of emerging markets in the 1980s and 1990s was 3.5%. In the boom period of 2003 to 2007, the growth rate jumped to 7.5%.
Okay, let's actually get that out,
right.
those figures out. Exactly, you said the world used to have for emerging markets a growth rate of 3.5%.
In the 80s and 90s, the long-term average is 5%, but we had this exceptional period between 2003
okay, there it is.
to 2007.
The long-term average 5%. That was from 1950 to now. For 60 years, emerging markets averaging around 5%. Then in the 80s,
it slipped below because we had a series of crises, which was, like the Mexican crisis, the East Asian crisis, the Russian default, and many large economies really were not growing that rapidly in that period. So we dipped to like 3.5%, a bit above that if you include the beginning of the previous decade.
Right.
And then we had this extraordinary boom from 2003 to 2007. And this boom was captured by the fact that in the peak year, 2007, only 3 economies in the entire emerging market space contracted. And those 3 were pretty insignificant: Zimbabwe, Fiji, and Congo. And that's never happened before.
Never happened before.
Exactly.
Because everybody was expanding.
Yeah.
So it sort of became the new norm, 7.6%. And now it's going down back to 5%.
Yes. So if you look at the estimates coming out for this year, we'll be lucky if we do 5% as the average growth rate for emerging markets. And that seems to be the new normal, which is like the old normal, that we're getting back to the old trend of 5%.
Right. So can I ask you, this 7.6% was a global phenomenon. Now, when India also grew by 9%, 8%, was it our own ability, or was it that we were part of a global trend?
Yes, I think this is one of the most misunderstood points that I think is present here, which is that what happened in 2003, after all, the economic reforms in India were carried out in the early 1990s. What happened in 2003, that India's growth rate, which till then was averaging 5.5%, 6%, all of a sudden in 2003, jumped up to 8 to 9%.
Because of our brilliant leadership internally.
That's what we like to believe.
Right.
But I think that what really happened was that we were plugged into the global economy, thanks to the reforms which were carried out in the 1990s. And then when this rising tide of global liquidity...
So the 1990 reform set the stage that we could take advantage of that expansion globally?
Yes, we were much more plugged in.
Yeah.
And so we saw this Levitation Act in India as well, where a growth rate jumped from 5.5% or so to nearly 9%
right.
until the boom in 2007, until we had the financial crisis in 2008, really.
So what was the main cause of this? The book you mentioned about a huge liquidity flows from the advanced countries to emerging markets, which may not happen again. Why did it happen and why may it not happen again?
Because central banks led by the Fed in 2003 started to very aggressively pump liquidity to try and shore up their economies. Right. And they succeeded partly in doing that, but a lot of that capital flew to emerging markets. Partly because emerging markets had done very poorly in the 80s and 90s, right. and some catch-up was due. Right. And also because the fundamentals had improved. The balance sheets of emerging markets had improved significantly in that period.
So this liquidity flew from the West into emerging markets, boosting everybody's growth rates up. And why won't it happen now?
Because once the souffle collapses, it's very hard to put it back together again. Right. So what we're seeing now is much more risk-averse behavior by commercial banks and other institutions in the West. And in fact, the European banks currently are in need of repatriating some capital back because of their problems at home.
Do you have the NDTV Profit app? All the markets, all the news and your own homemade, ready-made portfolio available there for you.
We will right now answer what you should sell, what you should buy when markets are down.
Download at ndtvprofit.com/apps. Get the best app from the channel you trust.